Tech would hurry up and come back, Pat.
What's the matter, Art? You got it in for the little fella?
No, I've been thinking about that drive arrangement on the route van. You know, the engine off to one side, the differential in the center and mounted on the frame, and those universal joints driving the rear wheels. I'd like to get some more dope on that setup. Tech could give me the lowdown if he were around.
Why, you've been giving Tech a bad time whenever he starts talking about the new job.
Yeah, but I've been trying to think where I'd seen an arrangement like that before. You know, it looks an awful lot like some of the Special Army trucks I used to work on.
Well, I guess Tech will be back. At least he said he would.
And when old Tech makes a promise, you can bet he'll keep it. I've just been waiting for you guys to get some free time. Now, what's eating you?
Let's put her up on the hoist, Tech, and I'll show you.
Well, while you're doing that, Pat, see if you can get Ralph over here.
This idea of mounting the differential on the frame, you said it's a new system, but I've seen something like it on one of those Special Army trucks.
Sure you have, Art. This system saw a lot of service. I don't want you to think it ain't been tried and proved before.
You know, this rear-end suspension and drive system is being used commercially for the first time on the route van.
I don't suppose we have to tell you how good it is since you used to work on them.
Well, I'll tell you, Tech. I was a lube jockey, not one of the hammer and chisel boys. I don't mind saying I don't know as much about the rear end as I'd like to.
Okay, Art. Do you guys remember what I told you when we first went over the van?
Let's see. You said the differential is mounted on the frame. Then we got a stub shaft coming out each side. And the stub shafts send the power through universal joints to the shafts that turn the wheels.
That's the picture, Pat. Now what do you say we get down to brass tacks? Notice how the differential is mounted to its support arms?
I see. There's a couple of studs coming out of the differential housing to hold it to the support arms.
Looks like these screws under the support arms help carry the differential, too.
Right, Art. Those are self-locking cap screws.
The rubber insulators between the support arms and the frame members look like the ones on the rear engine mounts.
Yep. And when you install them, make sure you get the large washers in the right position.
You know, Pat, those insulators help to cushion the shocks from the differential, and they also help to keep normal differential noises out of the body.
With a setup like this, I guess we got a lot to learn about the differential.
Art, you know, sometimes I think you'd be happier working on a kid's coaster wagon. Now listen, inside the differential and carrier assembly is the same as you've always seen on Dodge trucks.
The part that's new was the differential carrier housing and the way the drive shafts are mounted. This stub shaft, which is called the differential drive shaft, is supported by a ball bearing seated in the carrier housing.
That stub shaft splines into the differential gear, doesn't it?
Yep, just like the regular axle shaft, Pat.
Now on the outer end, there are splines to fit the internal splines of the universal joint yoke. The yoke is held to the shaft by a nut.
I get it. Instead of a shaft running from the differential to each rear wheel, like an ordinary truck, this job uses a short shaft and two universal joints that are connected to each other.
Yeah, and those two joints sort of telescope. One fits inside the other. Then as the wheels move up and down, the joints get shorter or longer, depending on the distance between the wheel and the differential. But, what's this cover?
It's a boot to keep dirt and water out of that sliding joint.
Those dust boots are mighty important, because if those joints ever lock, the first good bump will make the wheels squeeze the differential like an accordion.
Yeah, and those splines are chrome-plated for protection. Better keep an eye on the dust boots so they stay in good shape.
Is this shaft in the wheel hub keyed to the hub, Tech?
Nope. You got a full floating axle mounting in this job, Pat. You know, that's when the wheel is mounted on the housing. So the housing and not the axle shaft supports the weight of the vehicle.
Now, wait a minute, Tech. How can you have a full floating axle when you haven't got an axle housing?
Instead of the housing, we use a spindle attached to the rear axle. The wheel is mounted on that spindle.
That's right, Tech. The shaft goes through the spindle, then a driving flange is splined to the outer end of the shaft and is bolted to the wheel hub.
Yeah, I get it. Let's go back to what the wheels are really mounted on. These spindles. Yeah, I see. The spindles that carry the wheels are attached to this I-beam.
Sure, Art. And the springs are mounted on the I-beam. So the beam is what supports the weight of the truck.
Well, I don't know why you guys need me around here.
I can think of one good reason. All we know now is how this rear end setup works. I bet fixing something that goes out of whack is mighty tough. Of course, you can't remove the axle and the differential from this job as easy as you can from an ordinary truck. Better give us the bad news now.
Why, you squawking wrench bender, you. I ought to let you tear this whole job apart just to replace a drive shaft bearing. But, well, rules is rules, and the boss wouldn't go for it.
You don't have to remove the rear end, Art. You can fix this differential drive shaft unit right on the van. Get your tool dolly over here.
Let's just suppose that something went wrong inside that differential housing. Maybe a bearing is acting up and we got to replace it.
Okay, but give me a chance to show off here. I'll disconnect this universal joint that hooks up to the differential drive shaft.
That C784 spanner wrench holds the yoke while you take the nut off the shaft. Then use a puller to pull the yoke.
Hey, this dust guard is coming out with the yoke. Is that all right?
Sure, the guard's welded to the yoke. Now, Pat, the bearing retainer and the oil seal come next.
What are these shims for, Ralph?
They control shaft end play and act as a grease seal. We'll talk about them later, but right now, let's pull the drive shaft.
I hope you got a special puller to reach in there.
Always expecting the worst, Art? Just grab a hold of it and pull it out.
Oh, I see what you mean. A slip fit, huh? Is it always that way?
Anytime it isn't, seems to me you could just loosen the housing bolts to get the shaft out.
It'll always be a slip fit, boys, as long as the housing is aligned on the differential carrier properly. They use gaskets to line her up, and you should put in new ones if you're working in there. You'll find one gasket between the housing and carrier will usually give the right alignment on these DU models, but it may take as many as 3 gaskets to line up the housing on the EU models.
We went in there to look at the bearing. She looks okay to me.
Let's check these other parts, too. Like this oil seal. We want to make sure it's in good condition.
Attaboy, Art. And if you were working on a job that had been in service a long time, you'd check the oil seal contact surface. It must be smooth so it won't cut up the oil seal.
Before you reassemble a job, let's get somebody to turn the record. A part's checked out okay. Let's see you put it back together, Pat.
All right, the shaft and bearing go in first.
And I'll cut a couple of shims to shove in there for the bearing retainer.
Wait. Art, I'll bet you'd use a beating iron on a wristwatch.
Let me explain what those shims are for, Art. The bearing is pressed on the shaft and seats against a shoulder in the housing. The retainer, which bolts to the housing, holds the bearing snug against the shoulder and prevents shaft end play. But you'll notice that there's a space between the retainer and the housing. That space is taken up by shims, which act as a gasket to prevent a grease leak. They also prevent the retainer from binding the bearing.
How many shims do we use?
You'll have to measure this space, Art. So first, you hold the retainer in place by hand and measure the space with feeler gauges. Take that measurement and add 3 to 5 thousandths to it, so your total shim thickness will be 3 to 5 thousandths greater than the space. You may not hit it exactly because the shims are supplied in thicknesses of 15, 20, and 25 thousandths, but work out a combination that'll come as close as possible.
How come you add that 3 to 5 thousandths?
I see what he means, Art. You were just holding the retainer by hand, so when you tighten the retainer bolts, the shims will squeeze up. They'd bind the bearing and twist the retainer if you didn't allow extra space.
If you use too many shims, you'll get shaft end play. If you don't have enough, you may get a grease leak, besides distorting the retainer.
That looks like the ticket, Art. I'll put them in there and install the retainer.
Okay, and I'll finish up with the universal joint.
There she is, Tech. Your differential drive shaft assembly taken apart and put together again without pulling any big units off the van.
Now let's get out to the wheel end of this setup, Tech. What's the scoop on the wheel drive shaft?
It's a lot like the differential drive shaft, Art.
You mean we can work right on the van?
Nope. Take another look and tell me why you can't.
I get you. That bearing retainer sitting down in the axle flange, we couldn't get in there to a measure for shims, huh?
That's the story. So let's pull the wheel and then take the spindle out of the axle.
Drive that spindle out of the axle by tapping the bearing retainer screws with a brass grip.
There's the works. And what do we do with it?
Let's put her in a vise so we can work on it.
Hey, put a little protection on those vice jaws. That assembly costs dough, you know.
Art, I think you're growing to love this van.
Your next step is to remove the retainer cap screws and pull out the retainer and oil seal.
Next, the drive shaft. And I see the bearing is pressed on the shaft.
Sure. And notice there's another oil seal on the other side of the bearing.
And when you're working on this job, I suppose all these parts have to be cleaned and inspected.
That's right, Art.
That sure is a smart drive system, eh, Art?
You're right, Pat. But to hear Tech talk about it, you'd think he invented it.
Well, I may not have invented it, Art, but there's nothing you guys can tell me about it.
I'll bet I can.
Like what?
Like putting her back together again. First, the drive shaft and bearing go in.
Go in how? Get down to details, my friend.
Okay, Tech. The shaft goes in easy, so you don't jam up the inner oil seal. Then you take a feeler gauge and measure the
distance between the retainer and the spindle face.
Sure. And you make up a shim pack that's 3 to 5 thousandths thicker than the space you measured. Now, I'll install the shims.
And then the bearing retainer and the oil seal assembly.
You want that shaft to run on its own sweat? Pack the bearing with short fiber bearing grease. And also put some grease on the shaft between the bearing and the small outer oil seal.
That's it. Tighten the retainer cap screws evenly. You're ready to put the unit back on the axle.
You install it, Art, and I'll connect the universal joint.
How about adjusting the wheel bearings? Anything new on that?
No, just like on any other job. Turn the nut up until the bearings are tight. Then, you back the nut off about 1/6 of a turn until the wheel rolls free. Install the lock washer and the lock nut, and that's all.
Tech, we'd have to pull the differential if we wanted to work on the gears inside. How much of that iron work do we wrestle with?
I never knew a man with as sharp an eye for work as you have, Art. But you can relax. 'Cause like everything else on this van, pulling the differential is a lot simpler than it looks. Bring her down and take her over to your stall. Now, jack up the rear end a few inches. Then, well, you can probably tell us what goes on from here, can't you, Pat?
Well, of course, we'll unhitch the prop shaft and stub shaft universal joints. Then we'll unbolt the 4 mounts that fasten the differential supports to the frame cross members.
Wait, with the van jacked up, the differential might slip off. Why not just loosen the mounts and slip a roller jack under the differential to take the weight? Then unbolt the mounts.
Good idea, Art. With the mounts off, we'll roll the differential back till the support arms clear that front cross member and tip it down and roll it forward. How's that look, Tech?
It looks like you've been talking to the men who built this van, boys. Now, put it back in, and you'll know as much about the route van as I do. Now, what do you think of this new route van now, Art?
I gotta take back a lot of things I said, Tech. There's a lot of new design features on this truck, all right. But it isn't going to be near as hard to work on it as I thought when I first saw it.
I agree with you, Art. And everything about this van that's different from the trucks you've been working on is in the reference books.
Sure, there won't be any service problems on this job. The customers that buy these vans will be plenty happy with them. And me and Pat will see that they stay happy.